Alrighty, hi y'all. Welcome to The Ground Between Us, the podcast where the outdoor connects us all. My name's Eli. I'm your host. I'm really excited to be starting this. I'm so glad you're here. So this is going to be the introductory episode. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, about why I started the podcast, about what I want the show to be about, how I want it to operate, and sort of what to expect going forward.
Spending time outdoors isn't about escaping life. It's about remembering where we fit. Here, we honor the traditions that shape us, revere the life around us, care for the land beneath us, and connect to the world and the people around us. Because at the end of the day, we're all standing on the same ground. This is the ground between us.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then we're going to talk about the 5 pillars of the ground between us, which are the 5 sort of underpinning principles that I want to guide this show and guide our content. Those being tradition, conservation, stewardship, reverence, and community. And we'll go over each of those, why they're important, and explain a little bit about each of them. And then we'll just talk about the future, about things I have planned, future episodes, and directions for the show. So again, I'm so excited you're here. If you could subscribe to this show wherever you're listening or watching, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc., and let's get into it. So my name is Eli. I'm a father, I'm a husband, but pertaining to this show, I'm a lifelong outdoorsman. I have been running around in the woods since I was old enough to do so in Ohio and West Virginia, hunting, fishing, just screwing around, cutting down trees, just whatever I could get into. I've actually been a licensed hunter and fisherman for over, what would it be? Since I was 16 months old, roughly. My parents or my grandparents, I don't know who it was exactly. I'd have to ask my parents, actually. Somebody bought me a lifetime hunting fishing license, a hunting fishing trapping license, and trout stamp in West Virginia for my second Christmas. You know, that tells you a lot about how much the family I came from valued hunting, about my background, and about how much I value it as well. But, you know, growing up, hunting was just something that we did. It wasn't something that I thought about a whole lot. I was surrounded by a lot of people that were hunters. It didn't even occur to me that there were people that didn't do these kind of things for a long time. My dad and my pap was the one who kind of started hunting most recently in our family. He didn't do it growing up. He didn't shoot his first deer until he was 26 years old. And so he got into it and got my dad into it, obviously. And, you know, I was raised in a very different hunting culture than exists today because they were both, as my dad would say, old school West Virginia hunters. Like, they were shooting deer. They weren't hunting for antlers. They did if they shot a bigger buck, that was great. But a lot of times they were simply, and at the time they started hunting, you couldn't shoot does at all. So they were looking for something with antler above its head and trying to kill it. And that was sort of the hunting culture that I grew up in. Then when we moved to Ohio, it was quite a shock to meet a lot of the people, the guys that I was in school with and girls, whatever. The idea of like not shooting small deer was something that I hadn't encountered at all before. And like in high school, there were some deer that I shot that I deliberately didn't tell people about because you would get absolutely drugged if you shot like a basket 8-point or something. But I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here. So, point being, I grew up hunting it. My pap used to pick me up after school all the time. We'd go trout fishing. Hunting was just something that obviously it was something that I enjoyed, but it was something that I did. Like, I'm just trying to illustrate how important and ingrained this is into me. Like, if there was an opportunity to go hunting, like say a free afternoon that I had that I didn't go hunting, that I chose to do something else, like just stay home and play video games or whatever, I would actually feel really guilty about it. Basically, every free opportunity I had during deer season, I would hunt if I could, if I wasn't tied up with sports or homework or whatever. And I should also say that primarily deer hunting is what I've done growing up. We did a little bit of small game hunting. I've gotten into turkey hunting as an adult. That just wasn't something that my family did growing up, but we've all gotten into it. As we've gotten a little older, again, there just weren't a lot of turkeys around. My dad and pap were coming up, and then, so they never got into it, and then I never got into it, but it's a lot of fun. So I'm also trying to get into more small game hunting. I went rabbit hunting a few times this year. I would love to get into waterfowling, but anyway. So, and again, hunting was just something I did. It was a hobby that we had. It was a lifestyle, but it didn't occur to me. I had a lot of feelings about it, but I'd never heard anyone really articulate them. Sort of the more intellectual, spiritual, I guess, like the community aspect, the relationship with the land, those kinds of things. I felt all those things, but I had never heard those articulated before. So by the time I was like late teenage years, like getting out of high school, I had actually kind of moved away from hunting a little bit. It was still something I did. I still liked going to deer camp. You know, the social aspect of all that is still something that I love. But as I said, like I was hunting whenever I could as like a compulsion. Compulsion isn't the right word, like an obligation. First of all, I'm introverted, so like I was always looking for an excuse to say no to social engagements. But like I remember people inviting me places when I was a teenager and being like, no, like I think it would be good if we had a couple more deer in the freezer. Like I need to go shoot a doe. So that should give you an idea of how in the front of my mind this all was. But again, by the time I'd kind of become a late teenager, sort of like when I graduated high school and early college, I'd kind of not soured, but just kind of moved away from hunting as seriously. It was really exhausting. And I hadn't understood sort of I'm a huge Aldo Leopold fan. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And you'll hear about him, I'm sure, every single episode of the show that I do. But sort of that land ethic philosophy had not been like that was something I felt, that was something that was present around me, the guys I hunted around, my family and other guys, but it wasn't something that had ever been directly explained to me. So I kind of started to move away from it, as I said, like 3 times now. And then um, in like early college-ish, I found meat eater. And, if you understand hunting at all, you also probably know meat eater. Steven Ranella, he's an author, he's a podcaster, he has a hunting show called Meat Eater. Uh, he was the first one I heard start to articulate these things in this way and explain how hunting was conservation and how it was sort of this community, this sort of experience that you had with the land and like participating in your own natural history. And I also loved the way he handled the food. That was really fascinating to me and sort of having this reverence for it. So that really engaged me. And when I originally had gone to college, I had gone to the University of Akron for electrical engineering. I was in way over my head as far as math goes. I went to a smaller high school, and we only had through calculus 1 year of calculus. There was a lot of other kids there who had like 3 years of calculus, so the professors were teaching to them, and I was just so far behind. But so anyways, there was a college local to me, West Liberty University, that started a zoo science and applied conservation program after what would have been my sophomore year of college. So that was the first year they had the major. I applied to that. I got in. I moved back home. And that was really what started to turn me from like a hunter into a conservationist and an outdoorsman. You know, we talk a lot. You'll hear people say all the time, hunters are conservationists. And they are in the sense that they contribute a ton of money to wildlife conservation. And I think a lot of hunters are conservationists, but the reality of the situation is there are a lot that just because you're a hunter doesn't mean you necessarily care about conservation. There are a lot of hunters that don't. But through this program, through learning more about wildlife, learning more about ecology, learning more about how everything worked, I got really interested in all of that. In our conservation biology class, we read a Sand County Almanac, and that book just changed my life. Reading the way that Leopold talked about the animals and the land, the experiences he was having on his own private, like a relatively small tract of land. He was still having these incredible experiences with the outdoors. And then his land ethic and the way he articulated that we are part of a community, that we have a responsibility to do what's best for it. That all really stuck with me and really changed my trajectory. And that sort of ingrained this passion into me that like these things are really important, not just like hunting and fishing and everything, but I got more into like hiking and just general naturalist stuff like birding and herping and, all these different ways that we commune and interact with nature and how that deepens and is sort of a fundamental part of our human experience. That's really how I reached that understanding. So, now I work in environmental inspection, so I'm outdoors all day long. I love it. And it's sort of that these experience, all of that was to say that reignited my passion for hunting because it changed what it was. Not changed what it was, enhanced what it was, made it much more deeper, much more sort of fundamental, like to my humanity. And now it's like a fundamental, well, it always was, but now it's like a really fundamental part of who I am throughout like various aspects of my character, so, but I'm not like some accomplished hunter. I'm not some adventurer. I'm not a guy who's been all over the place hunting elk and bear and blah, 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 blah. I've hunted in West Virginia and Ohio, primarily on private land. Like, I'm just a normal guy. I have gotten more into public land hunting as I've gotten a little bit older and been able to do more things on my own. I've done bear hunting a couple times. That's something I'm trying to branch out into. Small game hunting, waterfowl hunting. Like, I am in the process now of becoming that person who does all these different things, and I really gained respect for the tradition of it. I'm learning about people like Leopold, like Grinnell, like Theodore Roosevelt. And these people all became heroes of mine, and I really respect what they did. I understand the importance of public land now in a way that I didn't before. I used to take that for granted. I just went on another tangent, but there's a lot of media around like people out doing these crazy adventures and this sort of like, I don't want to say hyper masculine because that isn't right, but like, you've got to conquer the mountain. And I don't think there's enough normal people talking about their experiences with the outdoors, about people like me, like most people who are sort of learning these things and expanding out into these things. And I have a fair amount of knowledge about this stuff because I went to college for it, and I love to read and study and learn about this stuff in my free time, even outside of like my formal education. And I'm also just like, I'm a pretty philosophical person, and I don't mean that in like I'm an intellectual or I'm smarter than anybody, but I just like to think about ideas a lot. And I think about a lot of the ideas that underpin all of this stuff, like the North American model of wildlife conversation, the North American model, geez Louise, the North American model of wildlife conservation, and like the idea of public lands, the idea of wilderness, and sort of just a lot of the ideas around this stuff I just like to think about in my spare time. What is a species? Like all these like really fundamental questions I spend a lot of time thinking about. So this podcast is meant to not only address like what I'm calling the outdoor tradition, which is hunting, fishing, whatever, particularly hunting and fishing. And that's going to be the angle I approach a lot of things from, but just experiencing the outdoors. It could also be things like backpacking or kayaking or whatever, but also from the angle of just like really wanting to explore these ideas and understand the natural world better. And so I've sort of broken this down into 5 pillars, sort of 5 different principles and angles and like sort of ways we can approach these different things. So let's talk a little bit about them and break each of them down. So to go along with that, like I don't claim to be a great hunter. I'm getting better, but I'm not like I've never shot like really this is the biggest buck I've ever shot. Like I've never really shot like what most people would consider to be a big deer. I'm getting better at it. I missed one last year, so at least I got the shot, or at least I got it close, at least I was in a situation to make a shot. But like, I'm not claiming to have knowledge I'm not claiming to be a good hunter. I'm not claiming that listening to me is going to make you a better hunter in the sense of the outcome. But I don't think that's always what hunting is about. I do, however, kill a lot of deer. I mean, I hunt Ohio and West Virginia both. I'm usually putting a minimum of 5 deer in my freezer. I don't eat exclusively wild game, but I eat as a household, me, my wife, and my son, who doesn't really eat that much, but I would say we eat between 200 and 250 pounds of deer meat a year. So this is really important to me in that aspect and the ability to feed my family. And, I really value the experience with the land. I guess my point is that I am a normal guy exploring these issues. I'm not sort of this already accomplished guy who's worried about outcomes, who's worried about shooting big animals. And if you are, that's your experience to have. I certainly wouldn't turn down shooting a big deer if I can. I spend a lot of time in Ohio in particular trying to shoot a big deer, but I'm not the kind of person that only shoots big deer. Like the meat and the experience and, that trumps everything else for me. So yeah, let's move on to the 5 pillars. So our first pillar is tradition. And when I say tradition, I'm referring to the deep history of engaging with the outdoors, particularly in this country, particularly in this country, the United States of America, but also just like human history. Now, I come at it from the angle of hunting, fishing, trapping, etc. But those aren't necessarily the only ways. There's things like boating, backpacking, good old fashioned camping, bird watching, trail running, all of those things. But this is something that is like America is one of the most recent, like as a country, like one of the most recent frontiers in world history. Obviously, there are other ones, but and I think we forget how embedded this is in American culture. The chance to be in the wilderness and sort of our right to experience these things, because frankly, a lot of places throughout the world, particularly I'm thinking like a lot of Europe, particularly like the UK, a lot of these things are the wilderness and the wildlife has been so degraded um that those experiences, the wildlife and the wilderness was so degraded so long ago that these experiences have kind of faded from the consciousness of the culture. And don't get me wrong, they're still there, but they're not there the way they are in American culture. And it's also very unique in the United States that we do actually have this right, because a lot of the European, and obviously, let's stop before we get any further. Obviously, there's this massive, deeply embedded culture of native peoples to this country engaging with the outdoors, of hunting, of fishing, of using animals, using plants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Foraging is another example of the tradition too, by the way. But coming at it from my perspective, from a white guy, let's just say it, someone who descended from European immigrants, the culture in Europe was very different in the sense that people literally weren't allowed to hunt. In many places in Europe, in that time, wildlife and forests were property of the nobility. So like, for example, and this is kind of the ultimate example, literally everybody knows the story of Robin Hood in America. I don't think it's one of the most ubiquitous stories in the Western canon. Like, I literally think you would genuinely be very hard pressed to talk to anyone over, say, the age of 10 who doesn't know about Robin Hood. He is in many ways a precursor to modern superheroes. He's this folk legend of epic proportions. And a lot of people don't realize that his sort of origin story was that he was walking through the royal forest owned by the king. There was a road going through the forest, and a group of foresters who were the king's employees who take care of that land for the king. He was on his way to an archery shoot, so he had his bow and arrows with him. And a group of foresters who are literally employees of the king, they're men who care for the forest and the animals for the king, sort of baited him into having a shooting contest, shooting at a deer. And Robin Hood, of course, being this this was before he was known, as Robin Hood. And of course, Robin Hood being this legendary shot with bow and arrow, he shot that deer and killed it. The foresters were furious because at that time, shooting one of the king's deer was punishable by death. So the consequences so not only was hunting not allowed, but the consequences for hunting were so severe that you could die from them, that Robin Hood had to recede into the forest and live a life of, fugitude. I don't know. Had to live the life of a fugitive because of this crime that he committed that was just shooting a deer. So so when these people came to America and they were allowed to provide for their family in that way and experience the outdoors in that way, that was a really fundamental freedom to them. That was a freedom that was, nearly as valuable as many of the other freedoms that we hold to be sort of fundamental to American culture, right? The freedoms outlined in the Constitution. So you sort of need to understand that that is the angle that a lot of American culture is coming from. Furthermore, for a lot of American history, I mean, until, the turn of the 20th century, like roughly 1900, and even further on in places like Alaska, large parts of the country were a literal wilderness, and huge portions of America's economy were dependent on natural resources that we got from the woods. Things like deer hides for leather, buffalo hides for leather, meat for commercial markets, which is no longer a thing, beaver furs for beaver felt, which was a very popular material for hats at one time. These are all really embedded into our culture, or embedded into our country's history. And so they sort of weave themselves throughout our culture. And like, think about the quintessential symbols of Americans throughout history. Things like cowboys on the open range, right? All of that open range land was important to be able to grow to raise cattle. Mountain men trapping beavers for beaver felt. Characters, real and fictional, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Paul Bunyan, Teddy Roosevelt. All these guys are sort of rooted in that outdoor culture. And today we still value that so highly that almost 40% of the country is publicly owned natural space. There are people in our government working to change that, much to my chagrin and many others. But this is something that we really, really value as a country. And this tradition also exists within like social groupings, within families and friends and communities. So, this is like in many ways the fundamental reason humans learned to cooperate was hunting and outdoor adventures and things like that, foraging. And many of the things like backpacking, hiking, birding, like obviously, well, maybe they were, but obviously like 10,000 years ago, people weren't birding. But all of these skills, like understanding things like hiking was a critical part of just being a person. Camping and understanding how to camp and sort of take care of yourself in the wilderness was fundamental to being a person. Foraging and hunting, obviously, like these were all things that were just fundamental parts of being people, and they were fundamental parts of our society, and they sort of tied people together. And these were skills and activities that were passed down for generations and sort of bound people together across space and time. And again, like you could make the argument that the reason society exists at all was because humans needed to cooperate to be better able to do these things. Understanding all of this is really important to understanding how we interact with the world today. And this show embraces that tradition. We covet it. I have, so many fond memories and so many great things that I've got out of the outdoors and people who've came before me. So on this show, we are going to explore and appreciate this history so we can better understand how it impacts the world today. The next pillar is reverence, which I would define as a deep sense of respect, curiosity, and reciprocity for the natural world. So nature isn't something for us to conquer or dominate. It's something for us to experience, to marvel at. It's something that we are a part of. And that inspires in us, or at least within me, this intense curiosity to try to understand this, and this respect and reciprocity to try to sort of give back to the natural world everything it's given me. In my experience, like understanding how the natural world works, even if it's maybe not pragmatic, and I think one of the great scourges of our culture today is thinking that all knowledge has to be extremely pragmatic and useful to be valuable. You hear all the time people talk about, like in school, for example, like, why did I learn such and such theory or such and so, why did I have to learn the Pythagorean theorem? Why did I have to read Shakespeare? Like, I'm never going to use that in real life. And it's not about whether or not you'll use it. All of these things deepen your character, make you a better person, make you a more well-rounded and informed citizen, and sort of enhance your experience of the world by understanding these things. So I think that understanding these natural things are a part of it. And just understanding like the difference between driving down a highway and looking at a roadside ditch and seeing a ditch full of weeds and being able to see, like, pick out wildflowers and see, maybe a particular bug flying around. Even just the understanding that that ditch supports an ecosystem and supports plants and animals, even if you don't understand what they are, I think that makes the human experience, like your everyday experience, so much more enjoyable. And I think it then deepens that reverence even more, and it just repeats and repeats and repeats itself. So as I said before, like the show, there'll definitely be a lot of covering directly on hunting and fishing topics, but we're also just going to try to cover subjects that deepen our understanding of the natural world. So that might not be things that are directly applicable to hunting or fishing or backpacking or whatever, but I still think it enhances those experiences by giving you a deeper understanding and respect of what is going on around you. The next pillar is conservation. So conservation will have a lot of overlap with one of our other pillars, that being stewardship. So for now, let's just define conservation. So I see conservation in this context as sort of our efforts as a society to conserve, preserve, enhance, restore wild places and wild things. Now, to really understand this, I think you need like a brief overview of exactly how wildlife management works in this country. So the most important thing to understand is that wildlife are all publicly owned. So if you're listening to my voice right now, and you live in the US, and in many cases, even if you don't live in the US, because there are many international resources like migrating birds, for example, monarch butterflies also migrate across, political lines or borders of countries. That's what I was trying to say. Anyway, if you can hear this, you are a partial owner of every elk, every deer, snake, salamander, mussel, whatever else that is alive right now in this country. They don't belong to the owner of whatever land they happen to reside on. That land owner can control your access to it, but they don't fundamentally own the creatures. They don't belong to the government. The government manages them on our behalf, but they're not their property. They're ours. They don't belong to the king. They belong to you. They belong to me, and they belong to every other citizen of this country and in many cases of the world. So this wildlife is then managed on our behalf by primarily state agencies, in some cases with things like, again, like migratory birds because they cross state lines, by federal agencies, and also in cases like endangered species. Although there are endangered species policies at both state and federal levels, but that's a whole nother story. So this means that we implement things like hunting laws, bag limits, seasons, etc., to conserve these resources. What this also means is they are not only property of every U.S. citizen who is alive right now. They're property of every U.S. citizen that will ever exist. And so we implement things like hunting laws, bag limits, hunting seasons, et cetera, to conserve these resources and ensure that future Americans will have the same or better opportunities that we have had. But this also refers to the scientific efforts being made to better understand these wild places and wild things. Things like biology, forestry, ecology, geology, hydrology. All of these things help us better understand these resources, and therefore we can better conserve them, restore them, care for them for future generations as a society. It also refers to things like policy, as I mentioned before, the Endangered Species Act, the Pittman-Robertson Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We'll go over a lot of these laws in future episodes, but all of these things, again, are societal efforts to ensure that this wildlife is around for generations. It also refers to our public lands. Again, this is also owned by the people. Anyone can access it. Sometimes there are fees because there's maintenance associated with this, but it's still a relatively democratic system. It's not like privately owned where a landowner could charge you $1,000 for a trespass fee or something like that. And there are plenty of examples of privately owned places that charge exorbitant, that's not right, exorbitant trespass fees or leases or whatever. And as I mentioned before, roughly 40% of the land in this country is publicly owned natural space, which is incredible. Like, there are very few other places in the world where that exists. And it's awesome in the true sense of the word. Like, it inspires awe. So on this show, we're going to explore these systems. We're going to advocate for these systems. And we're going to do our part to protect it, because there are people right now, as I'm speaking, making various efforts to try to weaken various portions of the system. Sort of the most notable right now is public lands, but there's also a bill right now to delist wolves, which is a whole nother thing. It's not so much that they're trying to delist them, it's that they're trying to do it with a bill. But we'll cover all those things eventually. But the point is, the system wasn't built on accident. As I discussed with the tradition, it was built by people over time, conserving and preserving these things, standing up for these things. And we need to do our part as a society to continue that so that future generations can enjoy these things as well. So, alongside conservation, as I mentioned earlier, is stewardship. So I'm categorizing stewardship as sort of your individual efforts to care for, improve the ecosystems you interact with, whereas conservation was sort of more broad, very broad societal efforts. So this could be things like land management, timber stand improvement, prairie restoration, whatever, all the way down to small scale things like native gardening, like going out and cleaning up trash in your local stream. So this show will explore all the ways in which you as an individual can take care for the places around you. And all right, let's back up a minute. So this is a personal journey I've been on. My family has a relatively small property here locally to me. And in the past few years, it's really occurred to me that I want to do my part to help leave it better than when I found it. So this is a journey that I'm on right now as well. But you don't have to own property to do this. You could do this on public land by, as I said before, things like cleaning up trash, things like volunteering for invasive species removal and things like that. But just doing something to leave the world better than you found it. So the show will explore the ways in which you can try to take care of the land, because as conservationist Doug Duran says, it's not ours, it's just our turn. All right. Our final pillar, community, kind of applies in two different ways. So first, there is the community you build with other people in the outdoors. As I mentioned earlier, personally, many of my closest friends, many of my fondest memories have been made through the outdoors. Hunting and fishing, camping trips for research in college when I worked in the crayfish lab. That was really cool. A lot of great things like that. My honeymoon was to Glacier National Park. So the outdoors brings people together in this way, and it's really beautiful, and we want to embrace that and highlight that. It unites people across space, across generations, across, socioeconomic classes, and many other activities. Hiking, kayaking, bird watching have these robust cultures and subcultures built around them. So one of the best ways you can bond with other people is having shared experiences in the outdoors, especially if it's something that's a little bit difficult. And this brings us back to our earlier discussion of tradition. So it also unites people across time. Like, it builds a sense of kinship with people from history who you've never met. It builds an understanding of like what it must have felt like to have been someone in the past doing the same activities that you're doing now. And I think that's really powerful. Second is the idea, the factual reality that we are part of the ecosystem. We have not transcended it in any way. We are part of that biological community. We participate in it. We are cared for by it. It's not something we're disassociated from. It's a system to which we belong. Going outdoors isn't about escaping. It's about coming home. It's about remembering where we fit. It's about appreciating the infinite complexity of the natural world, because it truly is infinite. Like, the more you learn there is to learn. And it's incredible. And it's really exciting. At least it is to me. Every living thing, like from the microbes in the soil to, a blue whale in the Pacific Ocean, it influences our lives in ways we don't realize and in ways we can't even comprehend. I think understanding that those relationships exist just makes your life infinitely more interesting. So the Ground Between Us will explore the ways that outdoors helps us find a sense of community with others, and also helps us find our sense of community within that natural world. So as far as future content goes, I've been posting on Instagram and TikTok, Facebook. I have 2 episodes recorded as of right now, the time recording this. I've got several other guests that I'm working on getting scheduled. So we're going to cover a wide variety of topics. As long as they fit within one or more of these pillars, they're fair game. So this could be things like actual practical hunting advice, habitat management, not just for like hunting, just like general restoring native ecosystems, conservation biology, ethics and philosophy is something that's really interesting to me that we'll talk about a lot. Fieldcraft, conservation policy is another thing that's really interesting to me. So some ideas I have include, covering the North American model of wildlife conservation, sort of breaking it down and explaining it. Episodes about conservation heroes, people like Leopold, people like Roosevelt, Rachel Carson, many other people who contributed to this history. The Endangered Species Act and sort of issues around it, generally with the act itself and then with its application to specific species. Pittman Robertson, the discussion of various books. As you can see, I have several back here, but some that I definitely want to do episodes on. Beyond Fair Chase, Sand County Almanac, Fred Bear's Field Notes, and many others. Ethical examinations, talking about, there's a lot of debate around things like using crossbows, around baiting for animals. Let's back up a minute. So most of the episodes that I have planned, like concretely planned interviews, do have a lot to do with Ohio and West Virginia, but I'm going to cover all topics, like in North America. It just so happens that I'm from this area, and most of the people I can get to say yes are from this area. So I'm going to have on who's willing to speak to me. But we will cover national issues, international issues in some cases if I think they're important. So, right now I'm speaking with a woman who does waterfowl rehabilitation, which is actually really rare. A woman who does, a retired fish biologist who worked for a federal agency, various advocacy groups, another fish biologist who currently works for a state agency, a guy who does tracking and recovery with drones and with dogs for big game, a crayfish biologist, Dr. Zach Graham, who recently wrote a book. I already have that recorded, so I can tell you about that, and various other people. And again, most of these people are local to me, but let's talk about some of the other topics that I plan to cover, because these are more general. So an explanation of the North American model of wildlife conservation, probably like a multi-part series. Episodes about conservation heroes, people like Leopold, like Roosevelt, Rachel Carson, George Bird Grinnell, people like that who are really influential and who deserve to be highlighted. Conservation policy, things like the Pittman-Robertson Act, sort of explaining that, the Endangered Species Act and issues around it, both sort of broadly with the act itself and then its application to specific species. Discussion of various books that I consider important, as you can see behind me. I have some of my favorites there. That's not all of them, but books like Beyond Fair Chase, A Sand County Almanac, Fred Bear's Field Notes, ethical examinations of controversial things in hunting, things like use of crossbows, baiting, drones, et cetera, things like native species and their importance, native gardening. I'm really excited to do some stuff on that coming up in the spring. Foraging, wild edibles. I freaking love ramps. Ramps are my jam. So in ramp season, you're going to have a lot of ramp content coming your way, but also other wild edibles, because that's something I've gotten more into in the last couple of years and I think is really cool. Explanations on common hunting policies, why we have licenses, why we have tags, why we have tag fees. That kind of rolls into the American model, but I think some of those things are worth splaying out on their own and explaining. And interviews with other like-minded people. So as I said several times, like, this doesn't necessarily have to be about hunting. Many of the interviews that I have set up so far aren't necessarily, many of them are hunters, but it's not necessarily going to be a hunting episode. Like Dr. Graham, we don't talk about hunting at all. We talk about the biology of crayfish. So that might not seem applicable on its face, but first of all, it might enhance your understanding. So next time you go fishing, you understand presenting crayfish-based lures a little better. But also next time you come up to a stream, you'll understand the incredible biodiversity that lives there, particularly if you're in Appalachia. And at least for me, like, that makes fishing so much more enjoyable. And maybe you'll spend a little bit of time putting down the pole and flipping some rocks looking for crayfish. But that's just one example of sort of like the things that we will talk about that might not directly apply to whatever activity you're interested in, but still have value. So I'm really excited about this. This is a new show, but I'm not new to podcasting. I do have a little bit of experience. So I'm super excited to go on this journey with you. I'm super excited to bring you guys more great content. So again, please subscribe wherever you're listening to this: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram, follow me on TikTok. I'm posting content daily on there, and I really hope everybody enjoys. And, I really hope you'll follow along and you'll enjoy and you'll learn something. But thanks so much for listening. And remember, y'all, we're all standing on the same ground.